Death row isn't just a place of waiting, but one of reputations and fear. And while most people associate horrendous crimes with men, there are women on death row, whose stories send shivers down spines even behind prison walls. These aren't just murderers. These are women whose crimes were so remorseless that they've become feared not just by the public, but sometimes by fellow inmates and even correctional staff. This isn't just about the death penalty. It's about the psychology, the horror, and the lasting imprint of women who redefined fear. Let's dive into the most feared women currently on death row and the stories that landed them there. Darlie Routier, Prison Facility, Mountain View Unit, Gatesville, Texas. Crime, murder. Darlie Routier's story begins in the suburban calm of Rolette, Texas, where life seemed picture-perfect from the outside. Married to her high school sweetheart, Darren Routier, and raising 3 young boys, Darlie was seen by neighbors as a typical stay-at-home mom with a flashy lifestyle. But all that changed on the early morning of June 6, 1996, when a frantic 911 call from Darlie reported a brutal home invasion. She told the dispatcher an intruder had broken into their home, stabbed her 2 sons, 6-year-old Devin and 5-year-old Damon, to death, and attacked her too, leaving superficial wounds on her neck and arms. By the time police arrived, Devin was already dead, and Damon passed away shortly after. Darlie, blood-soaked and frantic, was rushed to the hospital. From the beginning, things didn't add up for investigators. The crime scene felt staged as there were inconsistencies between Darlie's injuries and the brutality her boys suffered. There were no signs of forced entry, and the evidence began to point toward her. Investigators zeroed in on the blood evidence, the knife used in the killings, which was taken from the Routier's own kitchen, and her behavior in the aftermath, particularly a now infamous video showing her laughing and spraying silly string at her sons' graves during a birthday memorial just days after their deaths. Prosecutors used this footage to argue that she was cold, calculating, and unremorseful. In 1997, Darlie was convicted of the murder of her youngest son, Damon, and sentenced to death. The case drew massive national attention, with public opinion sharply divided. Some saw a grieving mother being railroaded by the justice system, while others viewed her as a manipulative woman who killed her children to maintain a lifestyle she could no longer afford. Over the years, numerous appeals and documentaries have kept the case alive, highlighting possible errors in the forensic work, questioning the fairness of her trial, and even pointing to potential overlooked suspects. But despite the growing cloud of doubt surrounding the case, the conviction has held firm. Today, Darlie Routier sits on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, awaiting a final resolution. She's one of only a few women in the United States facing execution, and her case continues to spark debates about maternal filicide, media influence, and the reliability of forensic science. Whether you see her as a heartless killer or a victim of flawed justice, one thing is clear: her story remains one of the most haunting and polarizing in Texas criminal history. Antoinette Frank, Prison Facility, Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, Crime, Murder. Antoinette Frank once wore the badge she would later betray. Born in 1971 in Opelousas, Louisiana, she joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993. Despite red flags, she failed psychiatric evaluations and even lied on her application, but a staff shortage and efforts to diversify hiring gave her a second chance. On March 4, 1995, Frank and her lover, Rogers Laquez, carried out a daylight armed robbery at Kim An restaurant in New Orleans East. The violence was ruthless. They shot and killed off-duty Officer Ronald Williams II and 2 family members, Ha Vu, 24, and Quang Vu, 17. But the aftermath was even more chilling. Frank didn't flee or hide. Instead, she returned to the crime scene in her patrol car, feigning concern and asking a survivor hiding in a freezer for details. Investigators later confirmed her identity through eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence. 3 counts of first-degree murder led to a swift conviction, just 22 minutes to find her guilty, and 45 minutes to decide she should be put to death. For nearly 30 years, Frank has remained the only woman on Louisiana's death row, currently held at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, where she has fought for clemency several times, raising childhood trauma, severe abuse, and PTSD, but every bid has been denied, even as her co-defendant saw his sentence commuted to life. Supporters argue that jurors weren't fully informed about her traumatic upbringing, but prosecutors and victims' families emphasize the brutality of her crimes. In one cold word, her crime was murder. Frank's story isn't just about the violence, it's about the betrayal of trust from someone sworn to serve and protect. She used her authority and access to weaponize her badge, turning public service into a death sentence for others. Her name still sends a ring across New Orleans as a symbol of the rare but devastating horror that happens when law enforcement becomes lawbreaker. A former officer, now a feared inmate, Tina LaSonia Brown, prison facility, Lowell Correctional Institution, crime, torture, and murder. On March 24, 2010, Tina LaSonia, her daughter Brittany Miller, and accomplice Heather Lee carried out an act so brutal it shocked even seasoned investigators. They targeted 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman, beating her with a crowbar, shocking her with a stun gun, and ultimately setting her on fire. The entire attack seemed premeditated and deeply personal, as if cruelty was the point. Audriana clung to life for 16 days before succumbing to the burns. It was a killing so strategized and so filled with rage that even the courtroom would later struggle to make sense of it. As investigators dug into the case, the pieces came together quickly. Surveillance, physical evidence, and witness accounts all pointed directly at Tina and her crew. Zimmerman's injuries matched the weapons the women used: a crowbar, stun gun, and accelerants. Police didn't just see a murder, they saw a calculated torture session. The motive wasn't clear-cut jealousy or revenge. It felt like domination, a need to inflict suffering. Tina's daughter and Heather Lee both turned on her during the investigation, trying to mitigate their own roles by painting her as the ringleader. It worked. Tina bore the full weight of the legal blow that followed. At trial, Tina's defense tried to argue that she suffered from untreated mental health issues, trauma, and substance abuse that clouded her judgment. But no amount of personal hardship could overshadow the cruelty of the crime. Jurors heard the gruesome timeline laid out in graphic detail and saw photos that burned themselves into memory. They learned how the victim had been lured, how she begged for her life, and how Tina showed no mercy. In 2012, she was sentenced to death, making her one of the only women on Florida's death row. The courtroom grew still as the sentence was handed down. There was no cheering, no relief, just quiet reckoning. Today, Tina Brown sits on death row at the Lowell Correctional Institution Annex in Florida. She has become one of the most feared women in the U.S. penal system, not because she led a cartel or plotted a massive heist, but because she displayed the kind of intimate, hands-on cruelty that's rare even among violent offenders. Hers wasn't a crime of sudden rage. It was drawn out, painful, and intentional. In prison, her name circulates with a kind of cold respect. She's one criminal known not only to have the murder mindset, but wanted her victim to suffer every step of the way. Kimberly Cargill, prison facility, Patrick O'Daniel Unit, formerly Mountain View Unit, in Gatesville, Texas. Crime, murder. Kimberly Cargill's case is one of those that leaves you stunned, not just for the crime itself, but for the way it unfolded. Born in 1966, Kimberly lived in Tyler, Texas, and was a mother of 4. But beneath the surface of what seemed like a typical life was a woman capable of horrifying decisions. On June 18, 2010, she took the life of Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old babysitter with developmental disabilities. What makes it even more chilling is the motive behind it. Kimberly murdered Cherry because she was scheduled to testify against her in a Child Protective Services case. Cargill knew that Cherry's testimony could strip her of custody of her son, and in her twisted logic, eliminating Cherry was the solution. That night, Kimberly picked up Cherry under the guise of giving her a ride to court. But instead of doing that, she drove her to a remote area, asphyxiated her, then dumped her body on the side of a rural road. And as if that wasn't horrific enough, she returned with lighter fluid, set Cherry's body on fire, and drove away. The entire act was designed to erase a witness, but it left behind a trail of evidence that pointed directly back to her. Investigators quickly zeroed in on Kimberly when they learned she was the last person to see Cherry alive. Her history with CPS, combined with witness testimonies and forensic evidence, built a strong case. During her trial in 2012, prosecutors painted Kimberly as manipulative and remorseless. They laid out her history of neglect and abuse, not just toward Cherry, but even in her parenting. Cherry's death wasn't some spur-of-the-moment act. It was a carefully planned execution meant to silence someone vulnerable. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Kimberly Cargill was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. What shook people most was how she sat through the proceedings, stoic, composed, almost detached. There was no public breakdown, no apology, just an eerie calmness that made the verdict feel all the more justified. Today, Kimberly Cargill sits on death row at the Patrick O'Daniel unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she awaits execution. She's one of only a handful of women on Texas death row, and her name is often mentioned in conversations about the rare but deeply disturbing crimes committed by women. The memory of Cherry Walker still haunts those who followed the case. A gentle woman taken in the most brutal way by someone she trusted. Krista Pike, Prison Facility, Tennessee Prison for Women, Nashville, Tennessee. Crime, murder. At just 18, Krista Pike committed one of the most horrendous crimes usually associated with such age. In January 1995, the Job Corps student from Knoxville, Tennessee, lured her 19-year-old classmate Colleen Slemmer into an isolated area under the guise of reconciliation. Instead, Pike, her boyfriend Daryl Shipp, and an accomplice ambushed and tortured Colleen for about half an hour. She slashed Colleen with box cutters, beat her with chunks of asphalt, carved a pentagram into her chest, and crushed her skull. As if that horror weren't enough, she kept a piece of Colleen's skull as a gruesome trophy, an act of such cold-blooded cruelty it still gives chills. Convicted in 1996 for first-degree murder and sentenced to death by electrocution, Pike became the youngest woman in modern U.S. history to receive the death penalty at that time. After a brief period at large, she was arrested and entered the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville. She has remained there ever since, the solitary woman on Tennessee's death row, serving time in near isolation in a cell you could mistake for a parking spot. No human contact beyond guards for nearly 3 decades. Behind bars, Pike didn't just wait for an execution date, she fractured again. In 2001, she attempted to strangle another inmate with a shoestring during a fire evacuation, earning a separate conviction for attempted first-degree murder. Legal battles followed, including a lawsuit that complained of unconstitutional solitary confinement, addressed only recently with a settlement allowing her limited privileges similar to male death row inmates. Even as her advocates argue about her age, mental illness, and history of abuse, courts have firmly upheld her death sentence, while her co-defendant Shipp just a few months younger at the time, awaits parole. Today, Krista Pike remains Tennessee's lone female death row inmate, a living remnant of one of the most chilling teenage killings in the country. Her young age, combined with the savage brutality of the crime, cements her as a figure both feared and enigmatic. Robin Roe Prison Facility, Pocatello Women's Correctional Center. Crime, triple murder. Robin Roe's story is one of the darkest and most chilling cases to ever come out of Idaho. In February 1992, a fire tore through the apartment of her estranged husband, Randy Roe, in Boise. Tragically, her 10-year-old son Joshua and 8-year-old daughter Tabitha, along with Randy, all died in the blaze. At first glance, it seemed like a heartbreaking accident, but investigators quickly picked up on unsettling details. The smoke detectors had been intentionally disabled, and traces of accelerants were found, indicating the fire had been deliberately set. The real horror set in when the investigation began digging deeper into Robin's life. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such a tragedy. Her 15-month-old son from a previous relationship had also died in a suspicious fire in 1980. At the time, it was ruled accidental, but when the 1992 deaths occurred, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Police uncovered that Robin had recently taken out life insurance policies on all 3 victims, totaling over $250,000. Her motive was heart-wrenching and carefully planned: financial gain. The loving mother persona unraveled to reveal a woman willing to kill her own family to collect insurance money. Her trial in 1993 shocked the entire state. The prosecution presented a strong case built around arson evidence, motive, and her disturbing history. Robin never took the stand in her own defense, and the jury didn't take long to return a verdict. She was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge handed down the death penalty, making her the only woman on Idaho's death row, a title she still holds to this day. Despite multiple appeals and petitions, her sentence has remained unchanged. Robin Roe now sits on death row at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center, far from the life she once had. To this day, she maintains her innocence, but the weight of the evidence tells a different story. Her case continues to be referenced in discussions around female killers and insurance-motivated crimes. It remains one of Idaho's most infamous tragedies. A woman who was supposed to protect her children instead orchestrated their brutal deaths for a payout. Patricia Blackman, Prison Facility, Julia Tutwiler, Prison for Women in Alabama. Crime, capital murder of a 2-year-old child. Patricia Blackman was trusted to care for a little girl named Dominique, her 2-year-old adopted niece. But on May 29, 1999, that trust was shattered in the most violent and unimaginable way. Authorities were called to her home in Dothan, Alabama, where they found the toddler unresponsive. The scene was horrific. Dominique had been beaten so severely that her tiny body showed over 30 blunt force injuries, including a fractured skull and internal bleeding. Some of the injuries were consistent with being struck by a baseball bat. A blood-stained bat was found at the scene. What shocked investigators even more was Patricia's behavior in the aftermath. She had placed several calls to 911 first, saying the child was choking, then later changing her story multiple times. It became painfully clear that she was trying to cover up what had really happened. There were signs the child had been beaten over a period of time, not in one burst of rage. Medical examiners ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma, and prosecutors argued Patricia acted with extreme cruelty and premeditation, possibly out of frustration or rage. There was no credible evidence pointing to anyone else. During her trial in year 2000, Patricia showed little emotion, and the jury didn't take long to convict her of capital murder. The brutality of Dominique's death and the fact that Patricia had a prior record of child abuse complaints made the case even more disturbing. the court sentenced her to death, making her one of the rare women on Alabama's death row. The judge noted the especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel nature of the murder in his decision. Her appeals have repeatedly been denied, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear her case in 2011. Patricia Blackman is currently on death row at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama. Over the years, she has maintained a relatively low profile behind bars. Despite the gruesome nature of her crime, her case hasn't gotten the same national attention as others, but those who know the story have never forgotten. The memory of Dominique, a helpless toddler who suffered at the hands of someone meant to protect her, is what lingers most painfully. Tierra Capri Gobble. Prison Facility, Alabama. Crime, capital murder. In December 2004, Gobble's 4-month-old son, Phoenix Cody Parrish, was rushed to Southeast Alabama Medical Center in Dothan with no pulse and multiple injuries that proved fatal. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull, broken ribs, arm and wrist fractures, bruising on his face, head, neck, and chest, and a tear in his mouth consistent with a bottle being shoved in, consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. At trial, the jury, seeing the unrelenting violence inflicted by a caregiver, unanimously convicted Gobble. Though the jury recommended death by a 10-2 vote, the law permitted such a sentence. The sentencing judge agreed, citing the murder as especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel compared to other capital offenses, and formally imposed the death penalty. Gobble appealed, arguing the sentencing court failed to make detailed findings on all statutory aggravating factors as required by Alabama law. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals agreed that procedural deficiencies required the case to be sent back for resentencing, though they did not dispute the intrinsic brutality of the murder by calling it especially heinous. Upon remand, the trial court re-evaluated the case, again weighing aggravating and mitigating evidence, and reaffirmed the death sentence. Today, Gobble remains on death row in Alabama, her conviction upheld despite procedural challenges. Her story is frequently cited in legal circles regarding capital punishment for child-on-child homicide and how courts must meticulously record their sentencing rationale. Samantha Allen. Prison Facility, Arizona. Crime, first-degree murder, and child abuse. Samantha Allen's case is one of the most haunting child abuse murders to come out of Arizona. In July 2011, she and her husband, John Allen, subjected 10-year-old Amy Deal, her own cousin, to hours of harsh punishment, all because they claimed she took a popsicle without permission. That night, under the scorching Phoenix heat, they forced Amy to do intense exercises like jumping jacks and running barefoot, and when they felt she hadn't suffered enough, they locked her inside a small plastic storage bin. They closed the lid, secured it with padlocks, and left her there overnight in a stifling garage. By morning, Amy was dead. Her tiny body had overheated and suffocated inside that box. At first, the adults in the household lied. They told the police that Amy had accidentally locked herself in while playing hide-and-seek. But investigators quickly saw through the lies. The truth was far more twisted. This wasn't a one-time punishment. It was part of a long, heartbreaking pattern of abuse. Amy had been routinely humiliated, beaten, and neglected by the very people meant to protect her. Samantha not only participated in this abuse, she orchestrated it, and even laughed as the lid to the box was shut, completely ignoring the child's desperate cries for help. When the case went to trial, the jury was shown a picture of just how cruel Samantha had been. The evidence showed no remorse, no humanity. The court heard about the disturbing conditions Amy lived under and how Samantha showed a shocking level of indifference to the child's suffering. In 2017, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The judge didn't mince words as he called the crime especially cruel and heinous, and the jury agreed. Her husband, John Allen, received a life sentence without parole, but Samantha's role was deemed so central and deliberate that the death penalty was the final verdict. Today, Samantha Allen remains on death row in Arizona, the woman currently awaiting execution in the state. Her case continues to spark outrage, partly because Amy was failed over and over again by every adult around her. This wasn't just a murder, it was the slow, calculated destruction of a little girl's spirit and body, and Samantha played a leading role in that. What should have been a home turned into a torture chamber, and justice, while delayed, caught up with her in the end. Maria del Rocio Rosie Alfaro. Prison facility, California's Central Women's Facility. Crime, first-degree murder, burglary, and robbery. Rosie Alfaro's life spiraled tragically early. By age 13, she was addicted to drugs, by 14, working as a prostitute, and by 15, a mother. At 18, she committed one of the most brutal crimes in Orange County history. On June 15, 1990, she targeted the home of a friend's family in Anaheim Hills, planning to steal money or goods to feed her addiction. She convinced 9-year-old Autumn Wallace to let her in by asking to use the bathroom. Once inside, Alfaro drew a knife and stabbed Autumn over 50 times, later loading stolen items into her car as though nothing had happened. Investigators quickly connected Alfaro to the crime. She left fingerprints and shoe prints at the scene, and blood from Autumn was found on her footwear. In a recorded interview, Alfaro confessed initially blaming 2 men for forcing her, later switching versions, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. Her addiction-fueled narrative crumbled under scrutiny, and she faced little doubt from prosecutors during the trial. In 1992, Alfaro was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances, burglary, and robbery. The jury, having deadlocked 10-2 in the first penalty phase, eventually returned a death sentence after a second trial. At just 20 years old, she became the first woman in Orange County to receive the death penalty and one of the rare women on California's death row. In 2017, a federal appeals court briefly vacated her sentence due to procedural issues, namely delays in carrying out executions, but a Ninth Circuit panel reinstated it, stating her constitutional challenge should have been raised earlier. Today, Rosie Alfaro remains on death row at California's Central Women's Facility. She is a tragic emblem of how substance abuse, violence, and mental health can intersect with devastating consequences. Despite her attempts to portray herself as drug-impaired or coerced, the brutality and premeditation of her actions in stabbing a defenseless child 50 times sealed a verdict seen by many as fitting her crime. Her story continues to be studied as one of the most shocking and sorrowful female-perpetrated murders in recent California history. Socorro Susan Cora Caro. Prison facility, crime, first-degree murder. The tragedy of Socorro Caro is both shocking and deeply heartbreaking. On the night of November 22, 1999, in an upscale home in Ventura County's Santa Rosa Valley, Caro shot her 3 young sons, 11-year-old Joey, 8-year-old Michael, and 5-year-old Christopher as they slept. Their infant brother Gabriel, who was just 1 year old, survived uninjured. After the killings, Socorro turned the gun on herself, shooting her own head, but miraculously survived the self-inflicted wound. Investigators uncovered a heartbreaking motive. Prosecutors argued she was driven by anger and resentment toward her husband, Dr. Xavier Caro, blaming him for restricting her spending and threatening divorce. Evidence showed she meticulously planned the shooting. The firearm was used while the boys slept, and blood spatter linked her to the act. While the defense claimed her husband may have framed her and argued a possible insanity plea, authorities traced Xavier's movements and determined he couldn't have committed the crime. In November 2001, after 5 days of deliberation, a Ventura County jury convicted Caro on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was followed by a separate sanity hearing to decide whether she would receive life imprisonment or the death penalty. In April 2002, the judge agreed with the jury's recommendation and formally sentenced her to death, stating the crime was premeditated and warranted the ultimate punishment. Her appeals have been rejected, including a 2019 California Supreme Court decision that reaffirmed her death sentence, labeling any disputed evidence admissible and harmless in the context of overwhelming proof. Today, Socorro Caro remains on death row at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. The case haunts many as the murder of 3 defenseless children in a quiet, affluent neighborhood delivered a jarring message about how domestic turmoil and a mother's despair can end in unthinkable horror. Valerie D. Martin, Prison Facility, Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Crime, first-degree murder. Valerie D. Martin's case reads like a twisted betrayal. In February 2003, she led her teenage son, Ronald Kupch, and 2 associates, Christopher Lee Kennedy and Bradley Zoda, in an ambush of her boyfriend, William Whiteside, who was hitchhiking in Lancaster, Los Angeles County. Instead of rescuing him, they knocked him unconscious, bundled him into the trunk of his own vehicle, and set the car ablaze with gas, while Whiteside burned alive inside. The plot was gruesomely calculated. Martin needed money to feed a drug habit, so she orchestrated the murder for profit scheme. Her own teenage son, a key player, aided in the violent attack. One of the young men, Bradley Zoda, later testified that Martin brought the gasoline and planned the murder herself. Whiteside's remains were found in the burnout car on February 28, 2003, alongside the melted bat and lighter pieces that tied the crime back to the group. At trial, the prosecution charged Martin with first-degree murder, involving lying in wait, robbery, kidnapping, and arson, and tied her directly to all acts, including conspiracy. Her other accomplices, her son, received life without parole. Kennedy also got LWOP, and Zoda, who testified, received a 10-year sentence. In March 2010, a jury found Martin guilty and imposed the death penalty. The verdict formally handed down on March 26, 2010. She's currently housed on California's female death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Maureen McDermott, Prison Facility, California's female death row at Central California. Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Crime, first-degree murder. Maureen McDermott was a registered nurse living in Van Nuys in April 1985 with her roommate Stephen Eldridge, a landscaper and co-owner of their home. They each held $100,000 life insurance policies on each other. McDermott, unhappy with Eldridge's intentions to sell the house and upset over how he treated her pets, allegedly hired her hospital co-worker Jimmy Luna to kill him. She not only offered $50,000 for the hit, but even instructed Luna to stage the killing as a hate crime, reportedly urging him to mutilate Eldridge's body by removing his genitals. Luna's first attempt in March failed, but a month later he returned and stabbed Eldridge multiple times. 44 wounds were later reported, inflicting a fatal blow. McDermott even asked Luna to stab her slightly to simulate a robbery gone wrong, a ruse meant to deflect suspicion from her. Evidence included phone records showing multiple calls between McDermott and Luna around the time of the murder, and she was found uninjured except for a superficial wound, evidence the prosecution used to undermine her story. In 1990, a Los Angeles jury convicted her of first-degree murder with special circumstances, lying in wait and murder for financial gain, as well as attempted murder for plotting the earlier attack. The same jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge formally sentenced her to die in the gas chamber. At the time, McDermott became only the second woman in California to receive a death sentence since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1978. McDermott appealed persistently. In 2002, California's Supreme Court upheld both her conviction and sentence, rejecting claims of racial bias in jury selection, inadequate defense, and prejudicial prosecutorial remarks. Even the prosecutor's argument comparing her actions to a Nazi by day and Mozart by night was deemed within bounds. In October 2023, the Ninth Circuit denied her latest habeas petition, ruling that referencing biblical passages in closing arguments and eliminating potential jurors did not violate federal law. Today, she remains on California's female death row at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where she's served as the sole condemned woman, living under a moratorium that has stalled executions since 2019. These women didn't just break the law, they shattered every boundary of human empathy, from calculated revenge to cold-hearted child killings. These women have proven that sometimes the most terrifying stories don't come from monsters in the dark, but from the people you'd least expect. Behind those steel bars are women whose crimes left scars on families, communities, and the justice system itself. And while their sentences may have stopped the violence, the weight of their crimes is still too real. If this series gripped you, like, share, and subscribe, because there's more to uncover. More shocking names, more disturbing truths, and more stories that force us to ask, how far can someone go before they lose all sense of humanity? Until the next case, stay curious, stay informed, and never look at a quiet face the same way again.